The word hit Pearl Baker like a slap across the face, spoken loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. Fraud. Dr. Elias Prout stood at the center of Redemption Creek's Main Street, his black coat immaculate, his silver watch chain glinting in the noon sun, and his finger pointed directly at Pearl like a pistol hammer drawn back. Behind him, a crowd of townsfolk had gathered, their faces tight with suspicion and something uglier, the particular cruelty of people who had already decided what they believed and were hungry to see it confirmed. "This woman," Prout announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being listened to, "has been peddling false remedies and dangerous misinformation to the vulnerable citizens of this town. She told the Calloway family their boy had a brain fever when I had already diagnosed him with simple exhaustion. She contradicts trained medical men at every turn. She is a danger to this community." Pearl did not step back. She had learned a long time ago that stepping back was the single most expensive thing a woman in her position could do. She stood in the dust of that street with her leather medicine case at her feet and her dark hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat, and she looked at Elias Prout with eyes that were as calm as a lake before a storm. "Young Thomas Calloway," she said, her voice carrying without being raised, "is not exhausted, Dr. Prout. He has a condition affecting his blood. If you give him 3 more weeks of bed rest and red meat and iron supplements from the apothecary in Laramie, you will have a recovered boy. If you continue telling his mother he simply needs sleep, you will have a funeral." The crowd murmured. Someone near the back made a sound of discomfort. Prout's face darkened to the color of old brick. "Get her out of this town," he said, and those words were addressed not to Pearl but to the crowd. And in that crowd, standing with his thumbs hooked into his belt and his hat pulled low against the sun, was Clarence Walker. Clarence Walker, who ran the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. Clarence Walker, who had brought Pearl to Redemption Creek in the first place. He had not said a single word yet. And in that silence, Pearl felt the first real edge of fear she had allowed herself all morning. Because she was beginning to understand that Clarence Walker's silence could either save her or destroy her in this town, and she still was not entirely sure which one it was going to be. 3 weeks earlier, Pearl had arrived in Redemption Creek in the way she arrived everywhere unannounced, unremarkable to those who judged only by surface, and carrying more knowledge in the leather case at her feet than most people in any room she walked into. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a botanist father and a midwife mother who had traveled the frontier their entire lives. She had grown up reading her father's medical texts by firelight, assisting her mother with births and fevers and broken bones from the time she was old enough to hold a cloth. She had learned from Shoshone women about plant medicines that no Eastern-trained doctor would acknowledge. She had apprenticed briefly with a physician in Denver who had been progressive enough to overlook the fact that she was a woman, and she had spent the last 4 years traveling the territories with her wagon and her case, going where she was needed. She had been called a miracle worker in some places. She had been run out of others. Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the spring of 1882, was the kind of town that could go either way. She had been parked at the edge of town for less than an hour, selling small remedies from the back of her wagon: dried willow bark for headaches, chamomile preparations for stomach complaints, a tincture of echinacea she had prepared in the old way her mother had taught her, when the first person approached her with something she recognized as genuinely serious. It was a woman named Clara Calloway, and she was terrified. "My boy Thomas," she said, clutching Pearl's arm before she had even properly introduced herself. "He's been sick for 2 months. Doctor. Prout says he just needs rest, but he keeps getting worse. He's tired all the time. He's pale. His heart beats fast when he tries to stand up. He's 12 years old and he can barely cross the room." Pearl listened carefully. She asked questions, not the questions Prout would have asked, but precise, specific questions about color, about appetite, about what the boy ate, about whether his gums looked pale, about whether he bruised easily. She asked about the water source in the Calloway home, and about what the boy had been eating before he got sick. She had a diagnosis forming in her mind before she had even seen the child, and when Clara took her to the Calloway house and Pearl examined young Thomas Calloway, the diagnosis was confirmed with a certainty that settled in her chest like the click of a lock. The boy was severely anemic. Not from some exotic disease, not from exhaustion, not from any mysterious frontier ailment, but from a combination of a poor diet during a hard winter, and likely a small but persistent internal issue that his body was struggling to compensate for. The paleness of his inner eyelids, the slightly enlarged spleen she could feel with careful palpation, the rapid heart rate on minimal exertion, the history of his symptoms, all of it pointed in one clear direction. She explained everything to Clara Calloway in plain language, wrote out clear instructions, and told her exactly what to obtain from the apothecary and how to prepare a proper diet for her son. She did not charge for the visit. She never charged when a family was clearly struggling. She did not realize until she was halfway back to her wagon that the story had already spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire, and that Dr. Elias Prout had heard every word of it. Prout came to see her that evening. He was polite in the way that dangerous men are polite when they are gathering information. He introduced himself formally, admired her wagon, asked about her training with the careful casualness of a man who was actually counting every credential to find the holes in them. "I studied under Dr. William Farthing in Denver," Pearl told him, which was true. "Before that I had extensive practical training from my parents, who were medical practitioners on the frontier for 30 years. Also true, if you were generous with the definition of practitioners. Her father's botany was medical enough, and her mother's midwifery was more sophisticated than most surgeons Pearl had met. And your formal degree?" Prout asked. "Women are not granted formal degrees from medical schools in this territory," Pearl said pleasantly, "which is a fact that reflects poorly on the medical schools and not on the women." Prout's mouth had thinned into a line. "You'll understand my concern," he said. "An untrained woman practicing medicine in my town." "I understand your concern perfectly," Pearl said. "What I find interesting is that your concern only arrived after I successfully identified what you had missed in a patient of yours." She was not usually that direct. But something in Prout's manner, the practiced condescension, the ownership he implied when he said "my town," had caught her at exactly the wrong angle of her patience. He left without another word, and Pearl had gone to sleep in her wagon that night knowing that the next few days were going to test her. What she had not anticipated was Clarence Walker. He found her the next morning at the well behind the general store, where she was filling her water containers for the day. He was a big man, not fat, but built on a scale that suggested he had been doing hard physical work his entire life, which turned out to be entirely true. He was broad across the shoulders, with hands that were large and calloused and capable-looking, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that was not handsome in any conventional sense, but was deeply, stubbornly interesting. He was 32 years old, though he carried himself with the settled gravity of someone older. He had dark hair going slightly silver at the temples and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green that Pearl would spend a considerable amount of time thinking about later. "You're the healer," he said. "I am a healer," she said. "Whether I'm the healer depends on who else is available." He almost smiled. "Not quite. My ranch hand," he said. "Hector Ray's, he's been down for a week." Prout looked at him and said it was probably a stomach complaint and gave him some bismuth. "He's not getting better." "What are his symptoms?" Clarence Walker told her. He was, she noted with approval, an excellent observer. He did not tell her about his own theories or what he thought the cause might be. He told her exactly what he had seen, in the order he had seen it, with a precision that she associated with people who paid genuine attention to the world around them. She picked up her case. "Take me to him." The Walker Ranch was 3 miles out of town, and Clarence drove her in his wagon rather than making her follow on horseback. The ride was largely silent, but it was not uncomfortable silence. Pearl had learned to distinguish between people who were silent because they had nothing to say and people who were silent because they were thinking, and Clarence Walker was clearly doing the latter. Hector Reyes was a man of about 40, Mexican-born, who had been with the Walker Ranch for 8 years. He was lying in his bunk in the hands' quarters when Pearl came in, and she could see immediately that this was not a simple stomach complaint. She examined him for a full 20 minutes while Clarence stood in the doorway, watching without interfering. She appreciated that most men would have hovered, offered opinions, told her what Prout had said as though that was relevant information rather than potentially misleading noise. Clarence simply watched. "He has a biliary obstruction," Pearl said when she straightened up. "Something is blocking his bile duct. It could be a stone. The yellowing in his eyes is just beginning. Most people wouldn't catch it yet, but it's there. He needs to be kept on liquids, no fat, no heavy food. I can give him something for the pain and something to help move things along. But if he is not significantly improved in 5 days, he needs to go to the hospital in Cheyenne." Clarence was quiet for a moment. What did Prout miss? "The early jaundice," Pearl said simply. "And he wasn't asking the right questions." She looked at Hector. "Have you ever had a stone before?" Hector nodded weakly. "Years ago, passed on its own." "It may do so again," Pearl said. "But we are going to be very careful and we are going to watch for any sign of fever. If you develop a fever, you tell someone immediately, day or night. Do you understand?" Hector understood. And something in the way Pearl had said it, not as a command but as a genuine and urgent request, as though his welfare actually mattered to her, made his eyes go wet. He blinked it away and nodded. On the drive back to town, Clarence was quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet now. Pearl could feel him thinking in a way that seemed to have something to do with her, and she waited to see what would come of it. "How did you learn all that?" he finally asked. "I paid attention," she said. "For a very long time I paid attention." "Prout went to medical school in Philadelphia," Clarence said. 14 years of formal training." "I know," Pearl said. "And he's a competent doctor for routine matters. His weakness is that he stops looking for information once he's found a diagnosis that fits approximately. A doctor who is looking for a stomach complaint will find enough evidence for a stomach complaint in almost any patient. The question is whether you keep asking questions after you think you have the answer." Clarence turned to look at her in a way that made her feel briefly seen in a manner she was not accustomed to. Most people either dismissed her or were startled by her. Clarence Walker looked at her as though he was recalibrating something. "I'll pay you for your time," he said. "I'll take reasonable compensation," she said. "But first let's see if your man gets better." He took her back to her wagon, and before he climbed back up to his seat he paused. "Prout's going to make trouble for you," he said. It was not a question. "He always does," Pearl said. "Men like Prout always make trouble. They believe their authority is more real than actual results." "And what do you believe?" "I believe in results," she said. "A patient either gets better or they don't. That tends to be rather definitive." Something moved in Clarence Walker's face. Not quite a smile again, but warmer this time. He tipped his hat to her and drove back toward his ranch, and Pearl watched him go with a feeling she recognized, but chose not to examine too closely just yet. Over the next week, she stayed in Redemption Creek. She was not planning to. She had a general direction she was moving, south toward Colorado, and she had meant to stay 3 days at most, but people kept coming to her wagon, and Hector Reyes needed follow-up, and there was a woman on the east side of town with a nursing infant who was struggling in ways that Pearl recognized and could help with. She told herself she was staying because she was needed. This was true. It was also not the entire truth, but she was not ready to examine the rest of it. Clarence came to check on Hector every day, and on 3 of those days he passed by Pearl's wagon first. Once to bring her fresh bread from the ranch cook, which she accepted with genuine pleasure because she had been surviving on her own fairly monotonous cooking for weeks. Once to ask her a question about Hector's progress. Once, apparently, just to talk, though she did not realize that was the reason until the conversation had been going for an hour, and she became aware that neither of them had mentioned Hector or medicine or anything practical at all. He told her about the ranch, how he had built it from essentially nothing after arriving in Wyoming Territory in 1875 with a small inheritance, a lot of determination, and almost no experience. His father had been a banker in Ohio, and Clarence had looked at the life of a banker in Ohio and known with absolute certainty that it would kill him more slowly and surely than anything the frontier offered. So he had come west. He had learned from people who knew the land. He mentioned a Shoshone elder named Running Water who had taught him about the seasons and the soil and the patterns that a man who paid attention could read in the landscape. And Pearl heard in his description of Running Water the same quality of respectful attention that she recognized in good learners everywhere. He had worked for other ranchers for 2 years, learning. He had bought his first cattle with the last of his inheritance. He had built his house with his own hands, a detail he delivered without pride or modesty, simply as information. He had hired good people, treated them fairly, and 10 years later his ranch was successful in a way that was solid rather than spectacular, not the biggest operation in Wyoming, but stable, well-run, respected. Pearl noticed that he did not mention a wife. She also noticed that he wore no ring. She noticed these things and then deliberately looked away from them, because noticing those things too early was the kind of recklessness that a woman in her situation could not afford. "What about you?" he asked on the third conversation. "Where are you from? Where are you going?" "Everywhere," she said. "I grew up on a wagon. My parents were always moving. After they died, I kept moving because it's the only way I know how to be." She paused. "My father died of cholera in '74 and my mother died of pneumonia 2 years later. They were both on the trail when it happened. Neither of them had any regrets about the life they chose." She said this last part quietly, and she meant it, and something in Clarence's expression told her he understood exactly what she was saying and what she was not saying. "Doesn't get lonely?" he asked. "Constantly," she said, with a directness that surprised even herself. "But loneliness and the wrong kind of company are both uncomfortable, and at least loneliness is honest." He was quiet after that, not in the way that meant he was troubled by her answer, but in the way that meant he was sitting with it carefully. She was developing a troublesome habit of reading his silences. The confrontation in the street came on the 10th day of her stay, and it happened because young Thomas Calloway's color had started to return. His energy was measurably better, and Clara Calloway had told 4 people about it in the same breath, all of whom had told 4 more. And Elias Prout had done the arithmetic and arrived at a number he did not like. So there they were in the main street of Redemption Creek, with Prout calling her a fraud and the crowd watching and Clarence Walker standing silent in the middle of it. Pearl had spoken her piece about Thomas Calloway's diagnosis. She had not raised her voice. She had not apologized. She was waiting. Prout took a step toward her. "You have no license, no degree, and no legal authority to practice medicine in this territory," he said, "and I am asking the marshal to see you out of town." "Marshal Gibbs," Pearl said. "I said his daughter's broken finger 3 days ago. I imagine he'll have a thought or two about that." A ripple of something like amusement went through the crowd. Prout's color deepened. It was at this precise moment that Clarence Walker moved. He stepped forward out of the crowd and stood beside Pearl. Not in front of her, he was careful about that. She noticed it and she remembered it, but beside her. A statement of position rather than an assumption of her need for protection. "Elias," he said to Prout, and his voice was the voice of a man who ran 700 acres and managed 30 employees and had never needed to shout to be heard. "You've made your objections known. Now this woman has something she needs to say and this crowd is going to hear it because a child is sick and the least we can do is listen to someone who might know why." Prout sputtered. "Clarence, you can't simply—" "I'm not telling you what I can't do," Clarence said. "I'm telling you what is going to happen." He turned to Pearl with a look that was entirely her cue. Pearl had already arranged her thoughts. She had known, from the moment Prout opened his mouth in that street, that this moment was coming. She spoke clearly and calmly, addressing not Prout but the crowd, explaining what anemia was and what caused it and what the signs were, speaking in language that a room of educated people could follow without a medical background. She explained what iron deficiency did to the blood, and why it made sense that a child who had eaten poorly through a hard winter would present with exactly these symptoms. She explained the difference between a diagnosis based on a single presenting symptom, fatigue, and a diagnosis based on a complete clinical picture that included pallor of the mucous membranes, tachycardia on exertion, and an enlarged spleen. She did not condescend. She did not attack Prout. She simply explained the medicine with the confident clarity of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. When she finished, the crowd was silent for a long moment. Then an older man named George Fenn, who ran the hardware store and sat on the town council, said, "And if you're wrong?" "If I am wrong," Pearl said, "then in 3 weeks Thomas Calloway will be neither better nor worse than he is today, and you will have nothing to show for my treatment but the modest cost of some iron supplements and some better food. If I am right, you will have a healthy boy." George Fenn nodded slowly. "And if Prout had been right?" "If Dr. Prout had been right," Pearl said carefully, "then rest would be improving Thomas's condition, not my treatment. I'll let the results determine who was correct." It was the right answer. Not because it was diplomatic, though it was, but because it was honest and it was logical, and Redemption Creek, despite its frontier roughness, had enough sensible people in it to recognize both qualities. Prout left the street with his dignity intact but his authority measurably reduced, and Pearl felt the crowd's energy shift in a way that told her she had bought herself some time. Clarence walked back to her wagon with her without being invited and without announcing himself, which she found she did not mind. "That was well done," he said. "I don't need your approval," she said automatically, and then heard herself and added more honestly, "though I appreciate it." He almost smiled. Again, she was beginning to develop a strong desire to see what his face actually looked like when he fully smiled. "Hector's better," he said. "Passed the stone yesterday. He's eating solid food this morning." Relief moved through her so cleanly she let herself feel it fully. "Good," she said. "Good. He needs to be careful, I know. He knows. You told him 6 times. Now there was warmth in his voice that she could hear even through his usual restraint. "He says you're the best doctor he's ever seen, and he wants to know if you'd consider staying." "Hector wants me to stay." "Hector," a pause. "Among others." She looked at him. He looked at her. The afternoon light was doing something generous to the planes of his face, and she told herself firmly that this was not relevant information. "I can't stay," she said. "I never stay." "Why not?" It was a simple question. It was also, she realized, the question that had been quietly sitting at the center of her life for 4 years without her ever quite confronting it directly. "Because staying means putting down roots," she said, "and roots mean risk." "What kind of risk?" "The kind where things you care about are in one place and can be taken from you." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful and low. "My wife," he said. "Her name was Ruth. She died 4 years ago, fever that started simple and moved to her lungs. She was 30 years old." He paused. "I know something about the risk of roots." Pearl felt the ground shift under her slightly. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "I spent 2 years after that not putting any roots down either," he said. "Just working, just moving. Different kind of moving than yours, but same impulse, I think." He looked at her directly. "Eventually I came back to myself." "I don't know if that helps you any." "It doesn't make me want to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay." And yet the silence that followed that statement was full of something that contradicted it completely, and they both knew it. She did not leave the next day. She told herself it was because she was monitoring several patients and it would be irresponsible to go. This was true. It was also not the entire truth. On the 14th day, there was another case. The man's name was Robert Daly, and he had been brought to Prout's office from a ranch 12 miles out with what Prout had diagnosed as a severe headache of the nervous type. Prout had given him a darkened room, a dose of laudanum, and instructions to rest for a week. Pearl heard about Robert Daly from the blacksmith's wife, who was Robert's cousin's neighbor, which was the usual frontier network of information. She heard it and felt something activate in her that she had learned to trust absolutely, a clinical instinct that was built not from any single piece of information but from the accumulated pattern recognition of years of careful attention. "Can I see him?" she asked the blacksmith's wife. "Dr. Prout won't let you near him," the woman said. "No," Pearl agreed, "but Robert Daly's wife might." Ruth Daly, no relation to Clarence's late wife, just the peculiar repetition of a common name, was a small, fierce woman who had been married to Robert for 15 years and who knew something was wrong in a way that no doctor's reassurance was going to touch. She met Pearl at the gate of Prout's house where Robert was being kept, and she looked at Pearl with the expression of a woman who has been told her fears are irrational once too often. "Tell me everything," Pearl said, "from the very beginning." Ruth told her. The headache had begun suddenly 3 days ago, not a gradual building ache but sudden, like a blow to the back of the skull. Robert had described it as the worst headache of his life, then some stiffness in his neck, some sensitivity to light. He had been a little confused yesterday, which Prout attributed to the laudanum. Pearl's blood went cold with a very specific kind of alarm. "I need to see him," she said. "Right now. This is urgent." Ruth let her in. Prout was not present at that exact moment. He was at the other end of town on another call, and Pearl went to Robert Daly and conducted the most focused examination she had ever performed. The nuchal rigidity was unmistakable. The photosensitivity was severe. The sudden onset of the worst headache of his life. The low fever, she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and it was there, subtle but present. The slight confusion. She knew what this was. She had seen it twice before, once as a child with her mother, once on her own in a settlement in New Mexico. She knew exactly what it was and she knew exactly how serious it was. "Mrs. Daly," she said, and her voice was controlled, but Ruth Daly was smart enough to hear what was underneath the control. "Your husband has meningitis. This is an inflammation of the membranes around his brain. It is very serious. He needs to be moved to a hospital immediately, Cheyenne, Fort Laramie, wherever has a full facility. He needs cold compresses for the fever, absolute quiet, and a doctor who can manage this in a proper setting. This is beyond what can be treated with rest and laudanum." Ruth's face went white. "How serious?" Pearl held the woman's eyes. "Very serious," she said quietly, "but treatable if we move quickly. The time we have matters enormously." Ruth was already moving. What happened next was the fastest mobilization Pearl had ever seen a frontier town produce. Ruth Daly went directly to the town council. George Fenn was persuaded in 3 minutes. Clarence Walker, who was in town that day to collect supplies, was informed within 10 minutes, and within 20 minutes Clarence's best wagon was being prepared for the long journey to Cheyenne with Robert Daly wrapped carefully, and a driver who knew the roads. Prout returned to find his patient being removed and his diagnosis openly challenged, and this time his fury was absolute. "You are playing with this man's life," he said to Pearl, his voice shaking. "If you move him and he dies, his blood is on your hands." "If we don't move him and he dies," Pearl said, her voice completely steady, "then we will know that doing nothing was the wrong choice. Both those things can be true at the same time. But I have seen this disease before, and I am telling you with everything I know and everything I am that this man needs a full medical facility, and he needs it as fast as this wagon can get him there." Prout turned to the crowd that had gathered, because it seemed a crowd always gathered in Redemption Creek whenever Pearl and Prout were in the same physical space. "You're going to let a woman with no credentials risk Robert Daly's life." George Fenn, who had a gift for speaking at exactly the right moment, said, "She already saved Thomas Calloway when you said he just needed rest. And her treatment of Hector Reyes got him back on his feet a week faster than your bismuth was doing anything. I'll take her judgment, Elias." Prout's face was a mask of controlled fury. He looked at Pearl one more time, and what she saw in his eyes was not just professional outrage. It was something more complicated, the dark mirror of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the authority, being the one people turned to, being the answer, and who was now being systematically shown that he had missed things. That was a harder thing to endure than she had perhaps fully appreciated, and for one brief moment she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Robert Daly left for Cheyenne that afternoon. Clarence Walker went with the wagon for the first 10 miles to see it safely past the roughest road, and when he came back to town that evening, his face was serious and quiet in the way it got when he was carrying something heavy. He found Pearl at her wagon. She was sitting on the step at the back in the blue dusk, not doing anything, just sitting, which was rare for her. He sat on the ground nearby, leaning against a wheel of her wagon, and they were quiet together for a while. The evening sounds came in around them, horses in the stable, someone playing a mouth organ somewhere down the street, the creek that the town was named after making its perpetual low sound. "You're scared," he said finally. "I'm concerned," she said, which was more honest than most people would have allowed. "Meningitis is serious. I believe I'm right about the diagnosis, but believing you're right and being right are not the same thing, and a man's life is involved in the difference. You did everything you could." "I know," she said. "That's not always enough." He looked at her for a long moment. "You carry this work like most people carry their families," he said. "All the weight of it all the time." "I don't have a family," she said. "No," he said quietly, "but you keep other people's alive." The simplicity of it hit her somewhere she had not expected. She looked away out at the darkening street and felt something move in her chest that she had been very carefully not examining for 2 weeks. "Clarence," she said. "Pearl," he said. They looked at each other in the dusk, and the thing that had been building between them was suddenly very present, very specific, impossible to keep characterizing as anything other than what it was. "I'm bad at staying," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not good at leaving. That's going to be a problem." "It doesn't have to be." She shook her head slightly. "A man who runs a ranch and a woman who runs a wagon," she said. "The math is not complicated." "Math is for people who have given up on the harder problem," he said. She blinked at him. That was unexpectedly clever. "I have my moments." And there it was, the full smile, finally, and it did exactly what she had suspected it would do to the whole geometry of his face. It made him look younger and warmer and profoundly alive, and she felt it like something clicking into place. "Go home," she said. "I need to think." "All right," he said. He stood up, brushed the dust from his trousers, settled his hat. He was almost out of the circle of lamplight when she spoke again. "Clarence," he stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for standing beside me today in the street with Prout. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said simply, and walked into the dark. She sat there for a long time after that. News came back from Cheyenne on the 5th day. Robert Daly had been admitted to the hospital. The doctors there had confirmed the diagnosis of meningitis. They had begun the appropriate treatment. He was very ill, but he was alive and stable, and the physician in charge had written a letter saying that the early intervention, the decision to transport him quickly rather than wait, had likely saved his life. The letter was read aloud at the town council meeting. Pearl was not invited, but Clarence was, and he told her afterward every word of it, standing in the late morning light outside the general store, and she listened with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes very bright. "The doctor in Cheyenne," Clarence said he'd rarely seen such an accurate field diagnosis in such early stages of the disease. He said whoever identified it should be commended. "No one will commend me," Pearl said, "but Robert Daly will recover, and that's what matters." "I commend you," Clarence said. "You're not particularly objective." "No," he agreed. "I'm not." She looked at him. He looked at her. The distance between them, which had been carefully maintained for 2 weeks, felt suddenly like something that required active effort rather than simply existing. Prout left Redemption Creek 2 days later. He did not make an announcement. He simply was not there one morning, and by afternoon his house was being cleared by an assistant. He had accepted a position at a hospital in Denver, it was said. He had decided that frontier practice was not suited to his particular gifts. Pearl did not celebrate. She felt the strange, complicated weight that she always felt when professional conflict ended not in reconciliation, but in someone's retreat. She had not wanted to drive Prude out. She had wanted him to be better. There was a difference. She told this to Clarence that evening when he came to find her, as he seemed to have developed a habit of doing, which she had also developed a habit of finding natural, and he listened without interruption and then said, "You're going to be the only healer this town has." "I know," she said. "That's a reason to stay." "There are reasons to stay in every town," she said. "That's part of why I keep leaving." He was quiet for a moment. What would make a reason to stay different from all the other reasons? The question landed so precisely in the center of what she had been turning over in her mind that she felt briefly exposed. She looked at him steadily. "If the reason wasn't just about being needed," she said finally. "If it was about something more than that." He took one step toward her, deliberate and unhurried the way he did everything. "Is there something more than that?" he asked. "You know there is," she said. "I know what I feel," he said. "I'd like to know what you feel." Pearl Baker had spent 4 years making hard calls. She had diagnosed what trained doctors missed. She had stood in streets while men called her a fraud. She had carried the weight of other people's lives in her medicine case and in her hands and in her mind. She was not afraid of hard things. She was afraid of this specific thing, which was exactly how she knew it was real. "I feel," she said slowly, choosing every word, "that I have not been in one place long enough to know if I can stand being in one place. I feel that you are the most genuinely decent man I have encountered in 4 years of traveling. I feel that I am terrified of what that might mean." Clarence Walker did not say anything immediately. He reached out and took her hand, which was a simple gesture and also an enormous one, and held it in his large, calloused, capable hand, and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been cataloging in her memory for weeks. "I'm not asking you to stop being who you are," he said. "I wouldn't want that. The woman who stood in that street and said what she knew to be true, that's not a woman you ask to be smaller. That's a woman you try to be worthy of." Pearl breathed in, breathed out. "You would be difficult to be worthy of yourself," she said. "We can try together," he said. She looked at their joined hands. She looked at his face. She looked at the street of Redemption Creek in the evening, which was dusty and imperfect and alive with ordinary human noise, and she felt the strangest sensation as though for the first time in 4 years, a particular kind of wind had stopped blowing. "I'll stay through the summer," she said. "That's all I can promise right now. Through the summer." "Through the summer," he agreed. He did not push for more. She respected him enormously for that. Through the summer turned into something much more complicated and much more wonderful than Pearl had prepared herself for. She set up a proper practice in a room that the town council arranged for her in a building on Main Street, with a sign on the door that said Pearl Baker, medical practitioner, which was not the same as Pearl Baker, doctor, but was honest and specific and told people what they needed to know. She ordered supplies from Laramie and Denver. She established a schedule of visiting the outlying ranches once a week on horseback. She was busy every single day. Redemption Creek had been underserved medically for years, not because Prude was negligent, but because one man simply could not cover the full breadth of what a frontier community needed. Pearl filled gaps that had been empty for years. She delivered 2 babies in the first month, set 4 bones, treated a ranch hand's severe skin infection that had been brewing for months, diagnosed a woman's early pregnancy that the woman herself had not suspected, managed a minor dysentery outbreak in a single week by identifying the contaminated water source and getting it corrected before it could spread. She was good. She had always known she was good. But there was something different about being good in a place that had time to see it, rather than passing through quickly enough that her competence was a brief surprise before she moved on. Clarence appeared in her life in a rhythm that felt both natural and carefully considered. He did not overwhelm her. He did not make demands on her time. He came in the evenings when she was finished for the day, and they sat on the porch of her little office building and talked, or rode out together on quiet evenings when the light was gold over the plains, or occasionally ate dinner together at the small restaurant that a woman named Hattie Prescott ran out of her house on the east end of town. Hattie Prescott adored Pearl immediately and made no secret of it. She also adored the idea of Pearl and Clarence in a way that was transparent to everyone except, for a rather long time, Pearl herself. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon," Hattie told Pearl one afternoon when Clarence had come in to collect Pearl for an evening ride and had waited patiently at the restaurant table while Pearl finished a cup of coffee. "He respects my work," Pearl said. Hattie gave her the look of a woman who had been married for 20 years and knew something about the difference between professional respect and the way a man looks at a woman he is falling in love with. She said nothing further, but her expression said it all. Robert Daly came back from Cheyenne in late July, recovered and walking and impossibly grateful. He came to Pearl's office on his first day home and stood in the doorway for a long moment, apparently finding words difficult, and then said simply, "My wife told me what you did, what it meant. I wanted you to know I know." "I'm glad you're well," Pearl said. "The doctor in Cheyenne told me the truth," Robert said. "He told me another day without proper treatment and I might not have made it. He said whoever sent me knew what they were doing." He paused. "You took a risk, speaking up against Prout the way you did. You put yourself on the line for someone you didn't even know." "That's what healers do," Pearl said. "Maybe," Robert said, "but not all of them do it with what you had against you." He looked at her steadily. "This town owes you more than it knows how to say. I'll be one of the ones saying it, though, for as long as I'm here." He shook her hand with both of his when he left, and Pearl stood in her office for a while afterward, feeling the strange fullness of a life that was beginning, for the first time, to feel like it was happening in one place rather than through many. It was a Tuesday evening in August when everything shifted again, this time in a direction that neither of them had precisely planned. Clarence had brought her out to the ranch to see a mare that had developed a respiratory problem. Pearl's knowledge of animal medicine was limited, but she had some, and the ranch's usual livestock man was out of town, and after she had done what she could for the horse and they had washed up and eaten dinner in the ranch house kitchen, the evening had grown long and comfortable, and then it had been too late to drive back to town. "Take the guest room," Clarence said, and his voice was entirely matter-of-fact, which was both reassuring and a little bit amusing. "It's late and the road is rough in the dark." The guest room was simple and clean and smelled of cedar. Pearl lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, the horses shifting in the stable, the creek below the south pasture, the wind in the cottonwood trees, and felt the life of the place as something entirely different from her wagon, entirely different from the town, particular and alive, and rooted in the land in a way that resonated with something she had spent years trying not to notice in herself. She had roots. She had always had roots. She had just been pulling them up before they could go deep. In the morning, over coffee at the kitchen table, Clarence looked at her and said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about roots," she said. He was quiet, waiting. "My mother," Pearl said slowly, "used to say that a traveling life was not a rootless life. She said that some roots go horizontal instead of down. She said people who travel don't fail to attach to things, they attach to more things than people who stay in one place, and they carry all of it with them." She paused. "I used to think she was rationalizing. And now I think she was right about some of it and not about all of it." She looked at him across the table. "I think you can carry people with you when you go, and I think you can go back to a place where someone is waiting. Those aren't mutually exclusive." Clarence set his coffee cup down carefully. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I don't know what you think I'm saying," she said, which was a small evasion, and they both knew it. "Pearl," his voice was very quiet, "tell me what you want." It was possibly the hardest question she had ever been asked, harder than any diagnostic problem, harder than any confrontation in any street in any town. Because wanting things was the most dangerous practice she knew, and also she was finally understanding the most necessary one. "I want to keep practicing medicine," she said. "I want to keep being exactly who I am. I want the freedom to go when I need to go and to come back." She met his eyes. "And I think I want to come back here." Clarence's expression was something she had never quite seen from him before, a full, open vulnerability that he had clearly been keeping carefully controlled for weeks, now simply present in his face without apology. He was not ashamed of it. He was a man who had loved and lost and had spent 4 years learning how to be honest with himself about what mattered. "Then come back here," he said. "You haven't asked me anything," she pointed out. "I'm working up to it," he said. "I want to do it properly." "Clarence, not today," he said, and there was a firmness in it that was also somehow entirely respectful. "I have something I want to show you first. Something I want you to see so that when I ask, you'll know exactly what you'd be saying yes to." She accepted this. She was learning to accept the particular rhythm of him. What he showed her was the south pasture, the following weekend, when the light was long and golden over the grass, and the mountains in the distance were blue-gray, and the creek made its constant sound, and the cottonwoods caught the late afternoon light and held it. He had built a small bench there years ago, and he sat with her on it and told her about Ruth, really told her. The full weight of it, the woman she had been and the loss of her and the 4 years of learning to carry it. He told Pearl because he believed she deserved to know everything, and because he believed that secrets between two people who intended to be honest with each other were the particular kind of hidden motive that could corrode everything eventually. Pearl listened. She told him about the men who had tried to diminish her, the professors who had refused to teach her, the doctors who had dismissed her, the towns that had run her out. She told him about the dark times on the road alone, the times when she had doubted herself so deeply she had barely been able to open her medicine case. She told him because she believed the same thing he believed about secrets. "Been asked before," she said, "to stay, to settle. 2 men asked me to marry them in the last 4 years. What did you tell them?" "That I couldn't be what they needed me to be." She paused. "What they needed me to be was someone willing to disappear into their lives and stop being myself." "I know," he said. "I would never ask that." "I know you wouldn't," she said. "That's the entire problem." He looked at her. "How is that a problem?" "Because it means I've run out of rational objections," she said. He reached into the pocket of his coat. What he brought out was not a ring, at least, not in the conventional sense. It was a small pocket compass, old and worn, with a brass case that had been polished smooth by long use. "This was my grandfather's," he said. "He was a surveyor. He traveled his whole life charting things, finding where things were in relation to each other. My father gave it to me when I left Ohio and told me it would always tell me where I was." He held it out to her. "I've been thinking about this for a long time, Pearl. I want you to have it, not as a ring. As a promise that wherever you go, you have something that points you back." Pearl took it from him. It was warm from his pocket, and when she opened it the needle swung smoothly and settled, pointing true north with the absolute certainty of something that had been doing exactly this for decades. "Clarence Walker," she said softly. "Pearl Baker," he said. "Would you consider marrying me? On your own terms, with the freedom to be exactly who you are, with a home here to come back to and someone here who will be proud of you every single day?" Pearl held the compass in both hands and felt it, the weight of the question, the weight of the choice, the strange and particular gravity of finally, after 4 years, wanting something stable enough to reach for. "Yes," she said. It came out quieter than she expected, and also absolutely certain. "Yes, I would consider that very strongly." He kissed her for the first time there in the south pasture in the long golden light, and it was gentle and warm and unhurried, which was entirely consistent with everything he was, and she felt the last piece of something settle into place inside her like a compass needle finding north. They married in October of 1882, in the small church in Redemption Creek, with Hattie Prescott weeping happy tears in the front row and Hector Reyes standing up for Clarence with his hat in his hands and his face full of genuine delight, and Robert and Ruth Daly in attendance with their 3 children. and half the town present because Pearl Baker had, in the course of 5 months, become the kind of person that Redemption Creek thought of as its own. Pearl wore a deep blue dress that she had made herself, which was not white and was not conventional and was exactly right. She carried no bouquet. She had a spray of dried wildflowers from the prairie tucked into her hair, which Hattie had arranged with great seriousness, and the compass in her pocket. The ceremony was simple and honest, performed by a minister who was new enough to Redemption Creek to not have an opinion about the irregular history of the bride's arrival. They made their vows and meant every word of them, and when the minister said Clarence could kiss his bride, Clarence kissed her with the same unhurried certainty he had employed in the South pasture, and the whole church made a sound of collective warmth. Afterward, at the reception at Hattie's restaurant, someone pressed a glass of apple cider into Pearl's hand, and George Fenn made a toast in which he mentioned, somewhat obliquely, that the town of Redemption Creek owed more than it could easily articulate to the woman who had arrived with a wagon and a medicine case, and had stayed to save lives that might otherwise have been lost. This woman, George Fenn said, raising his glass, was underestimated by people who should have known better. She was called a fraud by a man who couldn't bear to be wrong. She diagnosed what every other doctor had missed, and she did it with nothing but her knowledge and her nerve. He looked at Pearl directly. Redemption Creek is lucky to have her. Pearl looked at Clarence, who was standing beside her with his hand at the small of her back, and his expression entirely unguarded, for once proud and warm and utterly certain. She looked at the room full of people who had, over 5 months, gone from strangers to something that felt unmistakably like community. She raised her glass. "To accurate diagnosis," she said, which got a laugh that filled the room, and she let herself laugh too, genuinely and freely, which was a thing she was learning to do more of. The winter of 1882 was hard, which winters in Wyoming always were, but Pearl had her office and her practice and her home, which was the ranch, where she had moved her wagon and her books and her medicine case and her entire mobile life, fitting it somewhat improbably into the spaces of Clarence's established world in ways that turned out to require more creativity than conflict. She kept her office in town. She kept her horse, a tall gray mare she called Compass, because she was feeling sentimental, and she kept her schedule of visiting outlying ranches and homesteads. She ordered new medical texts from a publisher in New York and read them in the evenings by the firelight while Clarence sat across from her reading his own books on land management and animal husbandry, and the silence between them was the richest and most comfortable silence she had ever known. She wrote letters. She wrote to Dr. Farthing in Denver, describing some of her more interesting cases, and he wrote back with medical opinions and occasional requests that she consider contributing to a journal he was associated with. She wrote to a woman named Josephine Raines, who was doing similar frontier medicine work in New Mexico, and Josephine wrote back with case notes from her own practice, and the two women began a correspondence that was part professional exchange and part friendship, conducted entirely through the mail. She also began to experience, for the first time, the particular form of professional respect that comes when a community has enough time to see your work clearly. The diagnosis of Thomas Calloway's anemia and Robert Daly's meningitis had become the kind of stories that frontier communities hold onto, the stories that get told and retold, because they mean something about what paying attention can do and what missing things can cost. People came to Pearl from farther and farther away as those stories spread, from ranches 30 and 40 miles out, occasionally from neighboring towns. She turned no one away. She charged fair rates to those who could pay and nothing to those who could not, which was a practice that Clarence supported without reservation, though it occasionally made the monthly accounts rather tight. "We're not rich," he told her once when she had come home from a week of visiting poorer homesteads with almost nothing to show for it financially. "We're not poor either," she said. "No," he agreed. "We're not poor. We're comfortable and we're doing something with that comfort. I don't have a problem with it." She looked at him with the specific fondness that she had come to recognize as her most baseline feeling when she looked at him. "You are very easy to love," she told him. He looked up from his account books with the expression of someone who had been unexpectedly given something valuable. "You don't say that very often," he said. "I know," she said, "but it's true every day." He came around the table and kissed her in a way that made her forget momentarily what she had been about to say next, which she decided was probably fine. In the spring of 1883, Pearl discovered she was pregnant. She established this through a combination of her own clinical knowledge and a period of approximately 3 weeks of quietly observing herself before she said anything to anyone. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something more complex than afraid, aware, deeply and specifically, of how much she wanted this to go well and therefore how much there was to lose. She told Clarence on a Saturday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee between them, very directly, in the way she did everything. He was silent for long enough that she started to worry, and then she saw that his face was doing something she had never seen before, a kind of overwhelmed openness that was the opposite of his usual controlled gravity, and she understood that he was not worried. He was simply moved beyond his usual capacity for immediate words. "Clarence," she said gently. "Give me a minute," he said, his voice slightly rough. She gave him the minute. He used it to breathe and to look at her and to arrive at something that she could see him finding. "Pearl," he said, "I have wanted this for a long time. I had given up wanting it, which is a different thing from not wanting it. And now," he stopped. "And now," she said softly, "and now I need you to know that whatever you need, whatever you decide about how you practice, how you manage the work, all of it, I will be here and I will support you and I will trust your judgment about your own body and your own work absolutely." She had known she loved him for some time. She had not known the full depth of it until precisely that moment. "I intend to keep practicing," she said, "carefully, but fully. I am not going to stop being a healer because I am pregnant. The community needs me." "I know," he said, "and you need it." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Tell me what you need from me." She thought about it seriously because he had asked seriously. "Your absolute honesty," she said. "If I am ever actually compromising safety, the baby's or mine, I need you to say so, even if I push back." "I can do that," he said. "And I need you to let me do this my way, which will mostly not be the conventional way, and to trust that I know what I'm doing." "I already do that," he said. "That was never in question." She had a son in November of 1883. She named him William for her father, and Clarence held him in the first hour of his life with an expression of such thoroughgoing wonder that Pearl, exhausted and sore and happier than she had a way to describe, watched her husband meet his child, and felt the circle of her life come around to something she had not known she was moving toward. William was a healthy, strong, loud infant who grew into a healthy, strong, loud child. Hector Reyes, who had appointed himself unofficial uncle, was deeply invested in the boy's development and could frequently be found teaching William things that Pearl considered both impressive and slightly alarming: how to whistle very loudly, how to identify which clouds meant rain, how to read the wind. Pearl went back to her practice 6 weeks after William's birth. She had arranged, with Hattie Prescott's considerable organizational enthusiasm, a system by which William could be with her at the office on most days, and with Clarence at the ranch on the days she had to ride out to distant homesteads. The system was imperfect and required constant adjustment, and was, on balance, exactly how Pearl preferred to operate: practically, flexibly, and with the understanding that perfection was not the goal and resilience was. She was happy. She was specifically, clearly, grounded in evidence happy in a way she could have diagnosed clinically if she had needed to: the energy levels, the quality of sleep, the depth of engagement with daily life, the way she thought about the future without the habitual flinch she had carried for 4 years. The data was unambiguous. In the spring of 1885, Josephine Raines came north to visit. She was a tall woman from Georgia with an unstoppable manner and an encyclopedic knowledge of tropical diseases that Pearl found genuinely dazzling. And she stayed for 2 weeks, during which Pearl and Josephine had the most intellectually stimulating conversations Pearl could recall having with another person since her father died. Clarence fed them both royally and retreated with evident good humor from the dinner table conversations, which tended to run long and technical. He told Pearl afterward that listening to the two of them discuss medicine was like watching two people play chess at a speed that made the individual moves impossible to follow, but the result somehow inevitable. Josephine told Pearl privately that Clarence Walker was, in her considered opinion, an exceptionally remarkable man. "He is proud of you," she said. "Not in the way that means he takes credit for you. In the way that means he considers it one of the great good fortunes of his life to know you." "He is," Pearl agreed, simply and fully. Josephine went back to New Mexico with a collection of Pearl's notes on high-altitude medicine and a standing invitation to return, and Pearl went back to her practice with the renewed energy that came from being seen clearly by a peer. In 1886, they had a daughter. They named her Clara, partly for Clara Calloway, who had been the first person in Redemption Creek to trust Pearl with something important. Clara Walker arrived in August, loud and opinionated from her first breath, and William, who was 2.5 and had strong views about most things, accepted her with the gravity of a person who has been assigned an important task. Clarence held both children one evening in the summer of 1887, William on his left and Clara on his right, both of them asleep with the absolute trust of small children, and Pearl stood in the kitchen doorway watching him and understood, in the quiet total way of things that are simply true, that she had made every right choice. Not because it had been simple or because it had not cost her, she had given up the particular freedom of absolute mobility, the clean slate of perpetual newness, the way the road feels before you know where you're going. She had given those things up and she had gained other things, different and larger and rooted. She had not, critically, given up herself. She was still Pearl Baker, which she had kept professionally and which Clarence had never asked her to change. She was still the woman who diagnosed what doctors missed, who stood in streets and said what she knew to be true, who believed in results above credentials and attention above assumption. She was also Clarence Walker's wife, his partner, his particular and beloved constant. Both things were true all the time. In the spring of 1888, Thomas Calloway, now 17, healthy, strong, with the color in his face that Pearl had promised his mother, came to Pearl's office to tell her he was thinking about medicine. He had been thinking about it for a long time, he said. He wanted to know what she thought. She thought about it for a moment, and then she told him the truth. Medicine is not about credentials, though you'll need them because the world requires them. Medicine is about attention. It is about asking the next question after you think you already have the answer. It is about being willing to be wrong and being willing to say so and being willing to keep looking. She paused. It will be harder for you to get a good medical education than it should be because the system is imperfect, but it is possible. And if you have the commitment, I will write every letter of recommendation that is in my power to write, and I will tell them exactly what I know about your character, which is that you are alive because someone paid attention, and that you understand in your bones why that matters. Thomas Calloway left that office with the particular straightness of a young person who has been taken entirely seriously. Pearl watched him go with a feeling she recognized as the long continuation of something that had begun when she was a child reading medical texts by firelight. The passing of knowledge. The chain of attention, one person to another, stretching forward into a future she would not fully see. She went home that evening to Clarence, and the children and Hector Rays, who had stayed for dinner again, and Hattie Prescott, who had stopped by with bread and stayed for the same reason she always stayed. Because the Walker house had a quality of life in it that people wanted to be near, and she sat at the long kitchen table with all of them and ate and listened and contributed and laughed. After the children were in bed and Hector and Hattie had gone home, she and Clarence sat on the porch in the Wyoming evening, the stars enormous overhead, the creek making its sound below the south pasture, the cottonwoods a dark shape against the sky. "I've been thinking," Pearl said. "Tell me," he said, the way he always said it with the complete attention that she had never quite stopped finding remarkable. "I want to take on a student," she said, "a proper apprentice. Someone I can train the way my mother trained me, the way Dr. Farthing trained me. Someone who can eventually take over the practice when I need them to, so that this community always has someone." "Thomas Calloway." He guessed. "He's going east for formal training first," she said. "But yes, eventually I think Thomas Calloway, and perhaps someone in the meantime. There's a young woman from a homestead east of town, Maria Santos. She's 19, who has been assisting me informally for 6 months, and she has exactly the quality of attention I'm describing. Her family can't afford to send her east for school, and I am considering teaching her everything I know." Clarence was quiet for a moment. "You'd be building something," he said, "beyond yourself." "That's the idea," Pearl said. "I think it's the best idea you've had since you diagnosed Robert Daly's meningitis," he said. "High praise," she said. "I mean it," he said. "This is what you're for, Pearl. Not just the individual diagnoses, as important as they are. It's the whole, the knowledge, the passing of it, the insistence that paying attention matters. That's what you're building." She leaned against his shoulder in the dark. He put his arm around her and they sat together in the Wyoming night with the stars overhead and the creek below and the children asleep inside, and the whole weight of the life they had built together present around them like something solid. "I was terrified of this," Pearl said quietly, "of exactly this, the rootedness of it." "I know," he said. "I watched you be terrified of it. You were very patient." "You were worth being patient for," he said simply. "You always were." She tilted her head back and looked at the stars, which were the same stars she had navigated by on the road for 4 years, looking different now not because they had changed but because she had. They were not directions anymore. They were simply beautiful, and she had enough stillness to see the beauty of them. "Clarence," she said. "Pearl," he said. "I love you," she said, very specifically and very completely. She felt him smile against the top of her head. "I love you," he said, "in the same way." Maria Santos became Pearl's apprentice in the fall of 1888, and she proved to be everything Pearl had seen in her, possessed of the same quality of attention, the same instinct for the question behind the obvious question. Pearl taught her systematically and thoroughly, spending hours explaining not just what to do but why. Not just what the diagnosis was but how you arrived at it and what you checked and what you could not afford to miss. Maria was a fast learner with a precise, organized mind and a warm manner with patience that Pearl had not needed to teach. It was simply in her, a natural fluency with people who were frightened or in pain. She also had a particular gift with the Spanish-speaking families in the outlying homesteads, many of whom were more comfortable with her than they had been with anyone medical before, which expanded the reach of Pearl's practice in ways she had not fully anticipated, and which mattered enormously. Robert Daly, recovered and healthy and grateful still after 6 years, served on the town council and successfully proposed that the town build a proper medical facility, a small but real clinic, 2 rooms with proper equipment, attached to Pearl's existing office. The motion passed unanimously. The building went up in the spring of 1889. On the day they opened the clinic, Pearl stood in the doorway with Clarence beside her and William, now 5, on her shoulders because he was small and wanted to see, and Clara, who was 2 and had very strong opinions about being held by someone who was not her father just now, on Clarence's hip, and she looked at the sign above the door. It said, "Baker Medical Clinic, Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory." Below it in smaller letters, Pearl Baker, Medical Practitioner. Maria Santos, Medical Practitioner. It was the first time her name had been on a building. It felt like more than a sign. It felt like something she had not known she was working toward, stated clearly and permanently in carved wood and paint. George Fenn gave a brief speech. Hector Reyes cried, which he denied later. Hattie Prescott provided food for the entire gathering, which was virtually the entire town. After the gathering, when it was just Pearl and Clarence walking home in the early evening with the children between them, William's hand in Pearl's and Clara's in Clarence's, Clarence said, "How do you feel?" Pearl considered the question seriously, because he had asked it seriously and he always meant it. "Like I am exactly where I am supposed to be," she said. "Which is not something I ever expected to feel. I spent 4 years believing that the only honest way to live was to keep moving. I thought staying was a kind of defeat. And now I think my mother was right about roots going horizontal," she said. "I think I carry everything I learned on the road into every day I spend here. I think the traveling made me who I am and this place lets me be who I am, and those two things are not in conflict." He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his truest one, open, warm, entirely certain. "I have been thinking something," he said. "Tell me," she said, the way she always said it. "I have been thinking that the life we have made is extraordinary," he said. "Not in the way that means famous or remarkable to the outside world. In the way that means it contains more of what actually matters than I ever believed a single life could hold." Pearl walked beside him in the evening light with her son's hand in hers, and she breathed in the Wyoming air and felt the weight of the compass in her pocket, which she still carried every day. True north. It had always been pointing at this. Years later, years of work and love and children, and the specific ordinary texture of a life shared deeply people, would still tell the story in Redemption Creek. They told it differently depending on who was telling it, and the details shifted and the emphasis moved, but the core of it stayed the same. A woman came to town with a wagon and a medicine case and more knowledge than any room she walked into. She was called a fraud by a man who had missed what she had found. She stood in the street and said what she knew, and the town listened. She diagnosed what every other doctor had missed, and in doing so she saved the lives of people who would go on to live those lives fully and with gratitude. She stayed because she found, for the first time, a reason to stay that was larger than the need to be needed. She built a practice and a family and a legacy that extended forward in students trained and lives saved, and the particular quality of a community that has someone it can trust. Thomas Calloway came back from medical school in Philadelphia in 1892 with his degree, and his own particular quality of attention, trained further by Pearl before he was ready to practice independently, and he joined the clinic as its third practitioner. He was, by the account of everyone who worked with him, the best kind of doctor, the kind who kept asking questions after he thought he had the answer, who had learned not from the schools alone, but from a woman who had stood in a street and told the truth. Pearl Baker Walker, traveling healer of the Wyoming Territory, who had diagnosed what every doctor had missed, who had been underestimated by every authority that encountered her, and had simply, stubbornly, continued being right, lived the life she had built in Redemption Creek with her characteristic precision and warmth, and complete refusal to be smaller than she was. And Clarence Walker, who had stood beside her in that first public confrontation, not in front of her, not to protect her, but beside her as a statement of where he chose to stand, continued to be exactly what he had promised to be, the person who was proud of her every single day, who looked at her across the dinner table in the evenings and still felt the particular surprise of luck, the ongoing astonishment of having found this specific person in this specific world. On a Thursday evening in the fall of 1893, 11 years after Pearl had arrived in Redemption Creek in her wagon and stood at the well, and met a man who looked at her as though he was recalibrating something, they sat together on the south pasture bench. William was 9 now and Clara was 7, and there was a new presence in the house, a third child, a boy they had named James, who was 6 months old and currently asleep in the house with Hattie Prescott keeping watch, because Hattie had essentially appointed herself grandmother to all Walker children and no one had objected. The evening light was gold over the grass. The mountains were blue and permanent. The creek made its sound. Pearl took the compass from her pocket and opened it. The needle swung and settled, pointing true north as it always had, as it always would. She turned it in her hand and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at Clarence, who was watching her with the expression she loved best, open and warm and entirely certain. "Still pointing the right way," she said. "Always," he said. She closed the compass and put it back in her pocket and leaned against his shoulder and felt the whole weight of the life they had made together, which was substantial and real and rooted and exactly right. The creek ran on. The mountains held. The light went gold and then amber, and then the first stars appeared over the Wyoming Territory. And Pearl Baker Walker sat in the place she had chosen and felt, from the top of her practical, precise, endlessly curious mind to the deepest part of herself, entirely and simply home.